Hello and welcome to this King's Gambit video. I've seen that there's some interest out there in the King's Gambit, so I'm going to start a playlist of King's Gambit games by different players. Probably the first couple games will feature Bobby Fischer because his games are usually always instructive. And now we have a game from 1963, and I've enlarged my picture to try and cover up the moves over here in case some of you want to guess the moves as we go along. But this game is from 1963. Bobby Fischer with the white pieces, who plays the King's Gambit, is going up against Larry Evans. This game was played in New York. And let's begin here. Bobby Fischer, he starts off with e4, which he had famously said is best by test, the best opening move, especially if you want to try and attack for some advantage. It opens the bishop up quickly, the queen can develop as well. But what should the opponent do? How do you respond? What did Larry Evans do here? Larry Evans was a chess master. I think he made it up to 2,400 or higher as far as the rating. I don't know if he made it to Grandmaster level, but he responds with e5 here. So to get the King's Gambit, you'll have e4, pawn to e4 by white. Black plays e5, and now Fischer plays the King's Gambit, which is this move, f4. Now, why would you play this move? It looks like the opponent can just capture that pawn. So for beginners out there, you would just entice your opponent to take this pawn because it would pull this more valuable pawn off to the flank, allowing you to possibly place both pawns in the center. And then once that d pawn moves, you would have a discovered attack on the pawn. And also your opponent would be wasting time going after a pawn while you're able to continue your development. You could develop this knight. So let's see what Fischer does. After his opponent does accept the King's Gambit, so we have a King's Gambit accepted. Now remember, your opponent doesn't always have to accept the King's Gambit and take that pawn. They could decline, maybe by playing d6 and just backing up their central pawn that was on e5. So how does Fischer continue here? There's different things that you could do. Bishop to c4 is possible. You could just develop the bishop, but you do have the possibility here of the queen checking the king. So you could get rid of that possibility immediately by playing knight up here to f3 to stop that. Now, Fischer does not do that. He does not develop the knight up here. So, pause if you want to think about what he does, but we're still in the opening. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you. He goes bishop to c4. Now, this immediately lines up on this weak f pawn, which is only protected by the king. So that can be a weakness on both sides of the board in open games like this. So how does Larry Evans respond? Well, he attacks with the queen, delivering a check. And now, what should Fischer do? He can't push this pawn forward or the other pawn can capture. And if this pawn would try to recapture, well, then the queen could snatch up Fischer's rook. So Fischer plays king over to f1. He loses his right to castle, but he gets out of the line of fire. And let's see how things progress next. So now we have d6. This does prevent this pawn from pushing forward and attacking the knight if the knight moves to f6. It also allows the bishop to maybe counterattack Fischer's bishop. So let's see what happens. What does Fischer do here? He played knight to c3, and the computer says that that is the best move. You might think, well, why not immediately go here and attack the queen? That is possible, but this bishop could go here, pinning the knight to the queen. So let's see what Fischer has in mind. And just remember, I'll be doing a series of these videos with different players playing the King's Gambit. Probably the next video I do will be another Fischer game because I found an interesting little miniature game that Fischer played with the King's Gambit. But continuing on, we have bishop developing and attacking here. So we have to remember that this was a gambit. Fischer did give up a pawn, and at the moment, his opponent is ahead in material. So when you're ahead in material, you want to try to trade pieces off the board. So that's why Larry Evans immediately attacks Fischer's bishop here. So what does Fischer do? He develops his queen and defends the bishop. So now if bishop captures, queen can capture, and then the queen would also be targeting this unprotected pawn. Now, the computer says that queen to e2 is an inaccuracy, and interestingly enough, it prefers b3, protecting the bishop. And then if bishop captures, the pawn would capture towards the center. It kind of doubles pawns up on the c file, but it could leave a half-open b file for a rook, and that pawn would be closer to the center where it's a little stronger. But in the game, we had, by Evans, c6 being played here. So now there's maybe a threat of pushing the pawn forward. But now also, if there is a capture and the queen recaptures, this pawn is no longer able to be attacked now that it's on c6. All right, the game continues with finally knight to f3, so hopefully you found that move. And how does Evans respond? At this moment, there's one move that keeps a slight edge, a quarter of a pawn advantage with black. There's a move that keeps the game dead even, and a move that slightly gives the advantage to white. And all of those are queen moves. So, see if you can figure out what the opponent does. Well, Fischer's opponent plays queen to e7, an inaccuracy, and that was the third best move. But unfortunately, now Fischer has a slight advantage, even being a pawn down still. So the game continues. Now, the game is still about even, really. Fischer just has a slight edge, but only if he finds the correct move. And he does. He plays d4, taking a big share of the center here, unleashing a discovered attack on this pawn so he can try and regain that pawn and equalize the material. So capture, recapture, an obvious move. And now, what does Evans do? Well, he plays g5, the best move in the position, keeping his material advantage. He's also traded off a piece. But, he has doubled pawns. He's kind of opened up his king side, which is probably okay because Fischer's stuck on the king side here. What can Fischer do? Maybe move his king forward at some point to get this rook out. So take a look. What do you think Fischer would do here? All right. Fischer plays e5, which the computer says is a good move, but the preference by the computer is actually to play d5, immediately attacking this pawn perhaps. So the game continues with d5 being played by Evans. So maybe that's why the computer preferred d5 by white to prevent this move, which the computer says is a great move. White is still ahead at the moment, according to the computer. Material-wise, white is down by a pawn. Queen is under attack. What should Fischer do now? Well, according to the computer, the best move would be queen to b3, keeping an eye on this pawn, which is protected by Evans's queen. But Fischer played something else. He played the second best move, queen to d3. And according to the computer, this is a mistake now. Not a huge mistake, but the evaluation now is 0.45, so almost a half a pawn equivalent advantage to black. And the game continues with knight to a6, with the threat of launching forward here, attacking the queen perhaps, or maybe pushing this pawn and attacking the center. So the game continues with what? What does Fischer play here? Well, he drops his knight back. That will now allow him to push the c pawn forward, either to c3 or even up to c4 to attack the center. And Evans responds with knight to b4, attacking the queen. So here, Fischer has different options on where to move his queen. Once again, queen to b3 is preferred by the computer. What does Fischer play? He plays queen to d1. And now the computer is saying that that is the best move. So all those moves, the other queen moves were pretty close to this one. So it was kind of a toss-up on where you wanted to place that queen. All right, the game continues with a mistake by Evans. He castles to the queen side. And the computer does not like this, saying that now there's a 0.3 advantage for white. So Fischer continues with the best move according to the computer, and hopefully you found it. And that's c3, chasing this knight away. And now the knight can only move back to the edge of the board on a6, and that's where he goes. But, a knight on the rim is dim, is the saying. This knight is not doing much. Maybe it will attempt to reposition here and then get back into the game in the future. But in the meantime, it's Fischer's turn. And what does he do here? He plays h4, the best move according to the computer, gaining space on the king side. And maybe you didn't expect this move because Fischer's king is over here, but he is trying to possibly open up that h-file for his rook. And let's see how Evans responds. He declines that, plays the best counter move, keeping the h-file closed so that rook cannot activate, and he counterattacks Fischer's knight. So where should this knight go? See if you can figure it out. Well, the knight just drops back. Interesting how, it's another knight on the edge, but this was the best move because it's immediately attacking the pawn. So we have h5 protecting that pawn, and Fischer's turn here. He finally recovers his lost pawn. And with that, the game is about even, but white has a slight edge. And so we continue with queen takes h4, a blunder by Evans here. Now there is a possibility of a discovered attack with the rook, but not immediately because that rook's not protected. The king would probably have to step over here, and then, that knight could move out of the way. All right, so what is the move here? Apparently there's only two moves that keep the advantage with white, but one move is best. And I probably gave that answer away, and that's what Fischer plays. He moves the king to g1, defending the rook. And now we continue with knight to h6. So Evans is trying to activate his pieces. He has both of these knights on the edge of the board, and they're not looking too good. And now Fischer's turn. What would you play here if you were Fischer? Well, the game continues with knight to f1, a great move by Fischer. Now, instead of that move, the other options could be queen to c2 or, maybe a to excuse me, pawn to a4, but queen to c2 was an option, preventing that knight from moving forward perhaps, and delivering a check if the queen ends up here on f5. All right, so the game continues with knight dropping back by Fischer. And now we have a discovered attack on the queen, so the queen retreats. Fischer's move again. He goes after the pawn here. So now Fischer, let's look at the material. We have 5, 6 pawns versus 6, so material is even. The game continues with rook getting behind this pawn, perhaps wanting to press that pawn forward at some point. The game continues with knight stepping forward, preventing that pawn push. And now we have rook up to g6. From there, it can kind of cover a future pawn push here, perhaps. What else does this achieve? A possibility of bringing the other rook over in the future and kind of doubling up here. Let's find out. What does Fischer do? He retreats back, attacking the rook, the best move in the position. So that rook steps forward. But now, what does Fischer do next? He does have a discovered attack if he moves this knight. So that's a possibility in the future. Fischer just develops his bishop, centralizing it more and allowing him to bring his rook out in the future. Perhaps the idea of creating a battery here, lining up on that rook. So the game continues with knight back to c1, trying to activate that knight that was on the edge of the board. Fischer creates a battery here, and how does Evans respond? Well, he decides to drop his rook all the way back to the back rank, and it's Fischer's turn. So Fischer drops his knight back. He keeps that other knight on g3 to prevent that pawn from pushing forward and really restricting these escape squares off the back rank for his king. So now the knight on g3 will be protected by the other knight. The game and there's a discovered attack on this knight. So that is ignored. The best move is found. An attack on Fischer's pawn in the center. What does Fischer do? Fischer takes care of this pawn attack first with an attack on the queen. We have a recapture, and now we have 3 pieces attacking this knight and only 2 defenders. So Evans will have to do something about that. But it's too late because it's Fischer's move. So Fischer captures here. We have recaptures being ignored. So at this point, Fischer is winning. So let's take a look at that, how that played out. All right. Fischer drops his knight back. And here it looks like it's already too late. The best move is maybe rook to e8 or this f6 move. What else could be played here? Well, we only have 1 defender, so that knight is pretty much a goner. And you can go back further if you want to see how all of this could have been avoided. I'm not going to go into that, so let's continue and I'll show you the rest of the game. Pawn attack, Fischer takes care of that. Now we have all these pieces lining up on that knight. The knight's a goner, so Fischer snaps that up. When you're behind in material, you want to avoid trading pieces, try to trade pawns. So Evans centralizes his bishop and avoids the exchange that's possible, once that bishop was, when that bishop was still on f8. So Fischer attacks the queen, Hopefully you found that move. The response, queen to e6, trying to keep that queen somewhat centralized. And the game continues with Fischer playing what here? Well, he just centralizes his bishop and attacks pieces again, trying to trade off material. So we have rook creating a battery with the queen. Fischer attacks the queen. So now we have bishop capturing. Queen captures. Still leaving this attack on his opponent's queen. So queen retreats. And what does Fischer do next? And we're getting down near the end here. There's about 5 more moves by each player. So the game continued with Fischer playing rook to f6, tripling up on the open f file. And it's starting to look grim here for Evans. He's down a piece. And Fischer is building momentum. Knight moves forward, attacking the queen. What should Fischer do here? Well, queen to e5, the best move. If the knight moves, well then Fischer can trade off more material by exchanging queens. Now we have 2 attackers on that knight and 2 defenders. So how will things go? Knight to g5, offering the queen trade. Fischer does in fact trade queens. And now what does Fischer do next? Well, hopefully you found this. He just trades off more material, forking rook and king, forcing another trade. And this is where his opponent resigned, because Fischer is ahead by a full knight. The king is in check. So with that extra knight, Fischer should be able to win. All right, before you leave the video, let's take a look at the accuracy rating. Fischer played with a 96% accuracy rating, and that's under my image, so maybe you can't see that. I'm going to minimize it down. Hold on a second here. All right, now maybe my image is not stretched out as much as it was. Okay, let's drop that down even further. Okay, now hopefully you can see this. It looks like Fischer played with 96% accuracy, which anytime you get up in the 90s, it's good, but in the high 90s, that's outstanding. So Fischer had 96% accuracy rating. His opponent had 88.1. No brilliant moves, but Fischer had 2 great moves and 1 great move for his opponent. Now the bad moves. It looks like 1 inaccuracy and 1 mistake by Fischer, but 4 inaccuracies, 1 mistake and 1 blunder by his opponent. So Fischer played at a 3050 rating level, and his opponent played at 2300. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this interesting King's Gambit. This was the earliest example in the database that I looked at the earliest example in that database of Fischer playing a King's Gambit. So it was back in 1963. Maybe there are other examples out there earlier than that. But stay tuned in future King's Gambit game videos. I'll probably have another Fischer game playing the King's Gambit, maybe multiple games. And then I'll try and find other players playing the King's Gambit as well, especially some modern games, so you can get an idea of what the older King's Gambit games look like compared to the newer ones. And I'll also go back, before Fischer and see how they played the King's Gambit, in the 1800s maybe. All right. Like and subscribe if you haven't already to support the channel. Feel free to leave comments. As always, I enjoy hearing from viewers and subscribers. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.